and I don't like people preaching that I am any part responsible for anything. I've never heard him criticised the disabled.
I never have.
OK? Never. OK? And you are a campaigner, yeah? I'm going to go back to the last question. Please let me finish.
Mate.
Stand. Stand for Parliament. If you're going to campaign, then stand. OK? OK, you have the media profile for it. Do it.
My problem would be, mate, I'd stand for Parliament, but I'd be scared that I'd become one of them. I know what side of the argument...
No, I'm sorry. You've full addiction. You've full addiction and you've beaten it, OK? You can't preach that. That is rubbish.
Mate,
You cannot preach that.
I'm not preaching. What I'm
Well,
saying
you
is...
are. You've attacked him, OK?
Yeah.
OK? And you've attacked him, and you've attacked everybody that stands for his party.
I do.
I
do.
We're trying.
I'm sorry.
I'm not attacking people
they are
that...
people on the street.
Rich and racist.
Oh, are they? Rubbish. Rubbish. I'm sorry, but at the end of the day, it's the general public that are standing for him.
Trying to blame immigrants for the cutbacks because of his rich. Thank you, friends.
So, Brown, thanks very much. Let's take a question from the front row. Peter Hitchens, you had your hand up.
Before he goes, I'd like to ask the alleged comedian in the hat whether he... No, we've had a lot of him, and far too much for me, but he says he's not responsible for his own drug taking. Isn't the problem with the Western countries that we repeatedly say, oh, we're not responsible. When we take drugs, oh, we do it because we're made to. Somebody made me do it. When in fact, it's a pleasure that we seek. People do it because they want to. They do it for a pleasure. And then, as a result of the demand, which is quite rightly mentioned by the President of Colombia at the beginning of this, the demand which drives the supply, then ruin and murder and warfare and bloodshed and all the other evils descend on the countries which supply. It all comes from us. It comes from rich Western kids selfishly following their pleasures and creating a worldwide industry and a huge flow of money which is disastrous for the entire globe. And we don't ever address it.
Russell Brand, I'll let you have a quick right to reply. I think you were being called a selfish kid there.
He certainly is.
It's nice to receive your bigotry from another medium other than the hate rag, the Mail on Sunday, through which you normally peddle hatred, insular thought, lack of love between human beings. What I'm saying, mate,
have an argument for a moment, would you?
Whether or not I'm selfish or wearing a hat is redundant and irrelevant. These are the kind of personal attacks, the aggressive stance that you continually adopt to vilify people needlessly. Hey, what's next? Criminalise being a bit brown? Is that your next policy from the Mail on Sunday? We can't listen to people like you anymore. We're too evolved as a species.
That's an idiotic slur, and I notice you don't actually answer my argument. Are you responsible for your actions, or are you not? Do you take drugs because you have to, or because you want to?
In spite of what Margaret Thatcher said, there is such a thing as society. We are responsible for one another. If we treat people compassionately and with love, then people will benefit. People, of course, are responsible for their actions. You're responsible for writing for a bigoted newspaper.
Finish your joke, Russell Brand.
Are you responsible for your own actions?
OK, I'm going to move the debate on because there's a lot of people that we'd like to get questions from and responses.
Many young people in this country are being betrayed
What do you think we should do?
by a feeble government and a feeblest...
What do you think we should do, Peter?
I think we should enforce our law against illegal drugs.
More people in prison?
I don't want people in prison, no. I want people deterred from taking drugs,
How?
taking drugs which will ruin their lives by punishment.
How, though, mate? 'Cause I want that. I don't think people should take drugs,
you ask a question,
Peter.
you better listen to the answer. I want them deterred by effective policing. Listen to what I'm saying, you'll learn something.
I've heard it before, Peter.
Well, you plainly weren't listening that time either.
I don't even think you're ignorant. I just think you're innocent.
Effective policing.
You're like a peculiar child.
You see, ad hominem and interruption. Absolutely nothing remotely resembling reason, thought, or fact. And yet you are making a programme on drugs for the BBC,
mate, and
I am not. And that is what is exactly what is wrong.
Let's bring in one of the people. Let's bring in one of the people who's in
Although I have learned to love you, Peter, and in a minute I'm going to give you such a kiss on the lips, I'm going to challenge a few other of your prejudices.
Oh, my dear chap.
Let's get into the homophobia. It's just under the surface there. Peter, I think you're a lovely man.
How does one deal?
I think you're a Harry Enfield character.
How does one deal with a person who cannot debate seriously? Why is this person brought before select committees and allowed to make programmes on the BBC? He simply isn't capable of doing it.
Much indeed. Peter Hitchens.
Thank you. Good evening. The last time I had to debate the subject was with a gentleman called Russell.
Would you mind being seated for the purposes of the
I would mind immensely. I can only speak standing up. And I'll start again too. If I'd been told I had to be seated, you should say so first. I'm sorry. The last time I did this was a debate with a gentleman, a person called Russell Brand, an alleged comedian, whose ravings on the subject were beyond incoherent. I had expected better than this tonight. And when I heard that Mr. Snowden was an expert on dodgy statistics, I assumed that meant that he was against them. He's just told us that thousands of people have died as a result of the Misuse of Drugs Act. I wonder how that's been achieved.
Well, we've got Chip Summers, Peter Hitchens, David Burrows. Peter Hitchens, Russell Brand says this is a disorder. We should treat drug addiction like a disease. Do you agree?
No, it's a crime. It involves the possession of a Class A drug, which is a criminal offence, which people do voluntarily and they do it for pleasure. And if we continue to treat it as if it is a disease for which they should be sympathised with, there will be more and more and more of it, as there has been over the past many years. We do not anymore enforce our own laws on this subject. The very word addiction assumes that the person involved has no free will.
You have no sympathy at all for the people who get trapped on drugs for years on it?
Well, I have sympathy with anybody who gets themselves into trouble, but sympathy isn't the point. What I don't have is any sympathy with somebody who deliberately breaks a known law. They are criminals. They should be punished. And honestly, if they were punished for this, they would, by and large, not get into the trouble they get into, and there would be many, many fewer of them. But we don't do that. You can look at the figures for arrests of people, even for possession of Class A drugs, which we supposedly view most seriously. Of the ones who are convicted, fewer than 1 in 10 are actually sentenced to imprisonment. This is a Class A drug, the most serious.
Russell Brand, they are criminals. What's wrong with what?
I understand what Peter's saying, and I understand his frustration. As a person that has to deal with drug addicts in my life, they're a frustrating type of person to deal with. But I think, Peter, that if you can find in yourself to look at human beings with compassion and love, rather than with aggression, you'll find that there's more of an opportunity for progress. I know it's annoying.
Well, I don't wish to be lectured on aggression by you. You've been extremely aggressive to me in the past when we've met.
That's just because of the bigotry,
reason.
Peter. I don't mean it. I'm only having a bit of fun because of the Daily Mail stuff and that.
When you actually learn to use reason, you can accuse people of bigotry. Until then, I should keep very quiet about it. Learn to use some reason in this matter.
On Newsnight.
Why is a comedian being given a programme on the BBC to push a policy about drugs?
Because he has first-hand experience of drugs.
Why is our debate on drugs so debased that this is the kind of thing we are reduced to?
Peter, why are you so angry? What happened to you, mate?
I'm very ill and very sick, and those people need help, and we try and give it to them.
They'd have been better off if they'd been deterred from doing it in the first place, which is what we do not do.
And we don't do it with alcohol either.
Instead, the government mugs the taxpayer to the tune of £300 million a year to give drugs to people who are already on drugs.
David Burrows, that was something that I thought was shocking to find out, that nearly 150,000 people are prescribed methadone in this country. You know, should we be actually giving drugs to people and just sort of trying to keep them off the street rather than helping them kick their addiction, which is basically what Russell Brand said?
If we want to be caring, it's not caring just to simply give them methadone to park themselves up on methadone. And this government has recognised that this big tanker that's been throwing a whole lot of money into 300,000 on that tanker hasn't had a destination. It's been going around just giving them methadone, keeping them in the treatment, and not actually giving them an exit. And
there's not much. You've been in power for 2 years. There's not much sign that it's changing.
Well, 18% more people have come out drug-free in the last year, and now we're going to be paying people in areas to provide rehab and opportunities to get off drugs, and also to be get back into society again, into employment, into proper housing, and with that to pay them by the results, not just to pay them to get into treatment, but to get out of it, into society again.
The truth is the government is going to end up using methadone because it's cheap, surely. That is why.
Well, it's not actually cheap in the long run to be years and years in methadone. We're now getting geri addicts who've been on methadone for so many years. It makes sense for the addict and for those around them to get them off as soon as possible.
The truth is the law-abiding public are punished by the government through very heavy taxation for this ridiculous programme. Because the government is not prepared to punish people for breaking the law on drugs, which, if they enforced, would prevent an awful lot of people following the road which Chip has described.
And cost a lot more money as well, though, surely.
Well,
your approach would actually, a real war on drugs by your terms would cost a lot of money.
It wouldn't cost it endlessly. What we have done is committed ourselves to an endless programme, as I say, of mugging the public to give methadone to people who are already on drugs, which has over the past 40 years produced a gigantic increase in the number of people taking heroin and cocaine.
From Victorian Britain.
But Russell was one of the lucky...
He's a Tory MP, he's a fantastic fellow.
Well, we know that the Tory party, as we know, is a soppy Liberal party, so that's no surprise.
There's nothing easy and soppy by getting off drugs. Now, Russell is one of the lucky ones. Russell is one of the lucky ones who can come here and tell his story, and we want other people to hear that story. But the reality is that the access to rehab that Chip offers and others isn't enough. It's not around the country. We want to ensure that there's more people who will be able to access that treatment and tell that story. Whatever you think of Russell, it's a good story to tell.
And some of the most
inspirational people. In terms of the Olympics, some of the most inspirational people that you can hear about are those who have got through the throes of addiction and have managed to recover. And we need to hear more from them.
Who's telling the story of the parent of the young person who's in danger of becoming a drug user, who gets no help or deterrence from the government? Who's telling the story of the taxpayer who has to finance this failed, endless project? Nobody is telling that story, but he goes on television to tell the story from the sympathetic point of view. Let's be sorry for drug takers.
I never thought I'd be saying